Welcome back, everybody, to this video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of Plato's Apology, and we're going to begin to look at the way that Socrates responds to what he calls the newer accusations against him. And remember, these newer accusations are the official ones brought against him at court. And in previous videos, we looked how he responded to the older accusations that sort of built up this reputation he had. But now we're going to look at how he responds to the official accusations brought against him by Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. And the first thing we should do is remind ourselves of just what these accusations are. So remember, there are two accusations. First, Socrates is guilty of corrupting the young, so he's responsible for corrupting the young people, the youth of Athens. And two, of not acknowledging the gods the city acknowledges, but new daemonic activities instead. So I'm just going to say a few things right now about this charge, the second charge of impiety. But the majority of this video is going to be about the first accusation of corrupting the young. So how does Socrates respond to this charge of impiety? He simply says, well, he asks Meletus to clarify, what exactly do you mean by this? And Meletus eventually says, well, I mean you're a complete atheist. You don't believe in any gods at all. But of course, the charge itself, as you can see, acknowledges that Socrates believes in daemonic activities. Now, so what's a daemon? A daemon is a child of the gods, and Socrates thought himself to be in communication with a daemon who at various times, and he talks about this in the Apology, comes to him a certain voice in his head and warns him if he's doing something wrong. Now, you can think what you want about that claim, but in terms of the charge of impiety, if a daemon is a child of a god, then to believe in a daemon, one must also believe in God, or at least a god. And if Socrates believes in a god or some gods, then he can't be a complete atheist. And so in the way that Meletus has clarified the charge, there's an internal contradiction. Meletus can't both say that Socrates is a complete atheist and that he believes in daemons. Those two things simply cannot go together. So that's the fundamental basis, or the way in which Socrates rejects the impiety charge. But again, in this video, I'm going to primarily focus on this charge of corrupting the youth, and that's primarily because from a philosophical point of view, it's going to be more important to us because it really connects with Socrates' vision and his importance on living a good human life. Now, the first thing I want to take note of is the way he responds to this charge is he brings one of his accusers, Meletus, up in front of the jury to cross-examine him. He's going to ask him some questions, just like he did of Euthyphro, just like he often did in the Agora, the marketplace in Athens. And it's notable what Socrates says his fundamental purpose of this questioning is. He says, I, men of Athens, reply, it's Meletus who is guilty of playing around with serious matters, of lightly bringing people to trial, and of professing to be seriously concerned about things he's never cared about at all. And I'll try to prove this. So, and then later on he says, after he brings forward Meletus, you regard it as most important, do you not, that our young people be as good as possible? I certainly do. So what is Socrates trying to do here? He's trying to get Meletus to say up front, yes, of course I care greatly about the well-being of our young people, but at the same time he's going to show that that must be a false statement, because in fact Meletus isn't taking this seriously, doesn't really care about the corruption of the youth, doesn't really care about ensuring that the youth of Athens are in the best position they can be. Now there's a couple of things we should think about what Socrates says his purpose is here. The first thing you might ask is this really what Socrates should be showing? Right? Is this really what he should be demonstrating? Because notice what he's done here. He has accused Meletus of acting in bad faith, of being dishonest, of accusing him of doing a crime that Meletus doesn't really care about. And look, maybe Socrates is right. Maybe Meletus doesn't really care about this crime. As I suggested before, one of the fundamental motivations for the accusations of Socrates could have been political. And so maybe Meletus really doesn't care about this. But that fact alone doesn't mean that Socrates couldn't be guilty. It could both be true that Meletus doesn't really care about the corruption of the youth, and it could be the case that Socrates is corrupting the youth. So think about it this way. Imagine someone accused you of stealing, and they gave the evidence for why, for why they thought you had stolen this piece of property, and you were like, you know what? Why should we listen to you? You don't care about stealing. I know in the past you've stolen things yourself. Now that might be true. Your accuser could be a horrible hypocrite. Maybe they're a thief. Maybe they've been a thief for a long time. And so you might say, well, you don't really care about theft. But even if that's the case, it still might be true that you did it. It still might be true that given this evidence, we should believe that you've committed a crime. And so we have to ask, why is Socrates seemingly focusing on Meletus himself instead of the accusation? And it might be tempting to think that Socrates is doing this to deflect, because in some sense he thinks he might be guilty. And one might be able to make that argument, although I very highly doubt that Socrates at least sees himself as an agent of corruption of the youth. I think there might be another purpose that Socrates has here in doing this. Because you might ask the question, why does it matter that we take seriously the charge of corruption of the youth? Why does it matter that we take that seriously? Well, for Socrates, it would matter that we take this seriously because the question of whether someone is corrupting the youth or benefiting them touches on the most important philosophical matter there is, namely how to live a good life. If you're corrupting a young person, you're preventing them from living a good human life. And insofar as Socrates doesn't think there's any question more important than how should we live, how do we be excellent human beings, how do we flourish as human beings, insofar as he thinks that's the most important question there is, he doesn't think it's a question that should be taken lightly. And for that reason, it's very much going to matter to him that if you throw around an accusation like you're corrupting the youth, then you better be taking this seriously. This better be something you actually care about. And that's specifically why he's going to attempt to show that Meletus is not actually taking this as seriously as he should. Okay, so how does he show this? So he engages Meletus in a line of questioning, and basically he asks Meletus, well, if you know who's corrupting the youth, then you must also know who improves them. And he asks Meletus to tell the jury and tell him who is it that is responsible for improving the youth. Now we might question this as well. We'll actually return to this point in our next reading next week. But we might question this and we say, well, is that really true? I mean, to know whether someone is corrupting the youth or doing something bad, does the person have to know how to do that thing well? Right? And for Socrates, I think the reason he sees this connection is because what he thinks the sort of individual you would have to be to make an accusation about the corruption of the youth is an expert. An expert in what is good for a human being. And if you're an expert in what is good for a human being, if you know that what Socrates is doing in Athens is corrupting the youth, then you should also know what sort of thing would benefit the youth, would be good for them. And so Socrates thinks, well, if you are really taking this seriously, you must be an expert. And if you're an expert in human goodness, you must not only know how to make humans worse off, you must also know how to make them better off. So he asks Meletus to say, well, okay, who's improving the youth? And he engages Meletus in this line of questioning. So first he says, the laws are improving the youth. He says, okay, that's great, but I asked you for the person or persons who are doing it. So then Meletus says, well, these gentlemen, the jurors, of course, the people sitting in the jury who are about to give judgment on this case, he says, they're definitely improving the youth. And then Socrates says, well, all the jurors or just some of them? No, every single one. And then what about the people in the audience? Do they improve them? Yep, oh, certainly. What about the members of the council? Definitely them too. So when it comes down to it, in this line of questioning, Socrates gets Meletus to admit that the only person in Athens who is corrupting the youth is Socrates, and every other single person is benefiting them. Now you can see why Meletus might say this, since this is a trial which will be decided on a majority vote, he doesn't want to go out and insult a bunch of people in the jury and throw them in as individuals who corrupt the youth. And also we should notice how just on its face, how unlikely this would be. How likely is it that it just so happens there's one person in the city who's making the youth worse off and everybody else is improving them? That seems very unlikely. But Socrates goes deeper. He says, well, I'm going to explain to you just how unlikely this is with the following analogy. So I'll call this the horse trainer analogy. So Socrates says this. He says, I find myself, if you're right, in a most unfortunate situation. Now answer me this. Do you think the same holds of horses? Do people in general improve them, whereas one particular person corrupts them or makes them worse? Or isn't it wholly the opposite? One particular person, or the very few who are horse trainers, is able to improve them, whereas the majority of people, if they have to do with horses or make use of them, make them worse. So you can see where he's going with this analogy. He says, well, if you think about horses, it's the vast majority of people can't take care of a horse, right? They don't know what a horse should eat. They don't know what its exercise regimen should be, how much it should be sleeping, how to groom it, etc., etc. Like, I know nothing about horses. I have none of that knowledge. Now, there are people who have that knowledge, but they're specialized experts. They've gone through the proper education and proper training, and they know how to take care of horses. So he says, you can apply that to pretty much any sort of specialized knowledge, like auto mechanics know how to take care of cars, doctors know how to take care of people's health, lawyers know how to defend you at court, etc., etc. And for each one of those professions, only a small minority of people are auto mechanics or doctors or lawyers, right? It's not like this is common knowledge. So the basic point is that in any sort of scenario or activity where there's specialized knowledge, the experts who have that knowledge are a small minority. And the majority would be very harmful. If you just picked out an average Joe and asked him to take care of your horse, it would probably go very badly. So, what is the basis of the analogy here, right? How is this similar to human beings? Because we're talking about horses, we're talking about cars, right? Or even in the terms of medicine, we're not talking about the whole human being per se, we're just talking about health. But can this be applied to helping or hindering human beings to live great and flourishing lives? What are the similarities between taking care of a horse, taking care of a car, and taking care of a human being? So let's consider these similarities. One similarity is that both horses and human beings have a flourishing, right? What that means is just there's ways that a horse's life can go well or badly for it, and there's ways that a human being's life can go well or badly for it. So that's one similarity. You can imagine a good horse life and a bad horse life, a good human life and a bad human life. But also, and this is maybe the more controversial point, each of these takes expertise, as we just said. Achieving the flourishing of a horse takes specialized expert knowledge. And if Socrates is right, then achieving the flourishing and good of a human being also takes specialized expert knowledge. Now, it's not the knowledge of the doctor or the lawyer, but it's something else. Namely, it's expertise in what is truly valuable in human life. And for Socrates, we're not just born knowing this, right? In fact, we're born with instincts to pursue the wrong sorts of things. We're born with instincts to care purely about our pleasure and to avoid pain, to care about wealth, to care about honor, to care about all sorts of things which in Socrates' view don't really make up what a good human life is. Because as we've seen, for Socrates, a good human life is pursuit of truth and pursuit of wisdom and virtue. So, for Socrates, just like only a small number of people could adequately take care of a horse, he thinks only a minority, a small number of people, could really have the expert knowledge to know how to best guide a human being. And let's say that Socrates, and look, you might take issue with that claim, but let's say Socrates is right for a moment. How would our society have to change Now, one, you can probably see some undercurrents of his critique of democracy here, but let's look at a different context. So think about parenting for a moment. Now, in our society, what are the requirements you need to become a parent? There's pretty much no restrictions, right? So if you have a child and you mistreat your child, then Child Protective Services will come and remove your child from you. But I'm talking about beforehand. So let's say you found out you're going to become a parent. Does the state require any sort of test, any sort of aptitude evaluation to see if you'd be a good parent? Do you know the basics of what you need to take care of a child? Do you have any sense of the larger philosophical questions about what's most important in life? Now you could argue which of those things is most important, but notice we don't, in our society, make any effort to weed out those who we don't think have the proper skills and knowledge to take care of another human being. If you want to drive a car, then, just study up for a little bit and you take a test over a weekend. Right? But at least you have to go through some sort of procedure, some sort of test. If you want to become a doctor, you have to go through years and years of schooling. Right? Learning all sorts of very technical, detailed medical procedures. Right? And those are, of course, important. That's critical knowledge. But notice, you're only taking care of a human being's health. It's not like if you're a doctor, you're completely in charge of making sure that the patient's life goes well after that. We say that's their own responsibility, or at least it's not a medical matter. So if you're going to take care of a patient's health, if you're going to drive a car, if you're even going to get a horse, then you have to be licensed. And you have to go through various hurdles and a certain sort of education. But if you're going to be literally responsible for the good of another human being with a soul that can be corrupted or made worse, if you're going to be responsible for the path in life that another human being could take, if you're going to be in a position where you could horribly corrupt them or greatly benefit them, if you have that sort of responsibility, there is no test, there is no sort of hurdle we're going to make you go through. Anyone who can conceive a child is allowed to raise that child. Now again, I'm not saying that's wrong. Some philosophers actually have argued that there should be a sort of parent licensing procedure in place. But the point I want to make is simply that how different this is from the way we often view society. But in any case, in the context of this dialogue, Socrates is saying, well look, just like with horse training, human being training, we should expect that really, if you were just going to guess whether it's a small number who corrupt or the large number who corrupt, it would be more likely that the larger number, the majority, would corrupt the youth. And also you should know just how, strategically, how bad of a thing this is to say. Because the implication here is that the few individuals like Socrates are probably more likely to benefit the youth, whereas the majority, who's sitting in the jury and about to decide whether he lives or dies, they're more likely to harm them. Okay, so what he concludes from this, first, is that this doesn't make it seem like Meletus is really taking these charges seriously. Like, has he really thought about who it is that's more likely to benefit the youth? But there's even a further point here. So let's assume for the sake of argument that Socrates was actually guilty of corrupting the youth. There's another question. Would someone who's taking this seriously bring Socrates to trial? And Socrates wants to say that no. If Meletus was really serious about the charge, he never would have brought Socrates to trial in the first place. And I'm going to call this the instruct, don't punish argument. So the first premise is relatively straightforward. If we assume, let's just assume for the sake of argument, Socrates is corrupting the youth, that means Socrates must be either doing so intentionally or unintentionally. Either he means to corrupt the youth, he's intentionally doing it, or just an accident. Those are the two options. Now, we're going to come back to P2 because it's more complicated. But P3 says, if it is true that Socrates is corrupting the youth unintentionally, So if we imagine that the corruption of the youth Socrates is causing is just an accident, then he says, I should have been taken aside for private instruction and admonishment instead of charged in court. And this makes sense, because if Meletus was really concerned about whether the youth were being corrupted or benefited, and he saw Socrates and he said, Socrates is doing all these things he doesn't understand, he's accidentally making the youth worse off, then the first step wouldn't be to bring Socrates to court. Maybe at some point that would be what you would do. But the first action you would do is just to pull Socrates aside and say, look, I know you don't understand how what you're doing is causing the corruption of the youth, but here's how it's happening. I know this is an accident, but let's just fix your behavior. Right? You would say, let's just fix your behavior so this doesn't happen in the future. So, okay, and that seems right. Right? It doesn't seem accurate or it doesn't seem fair to bring people to court and charge them with crimes if it's really purely an accident. We should talk to them about it first. But of course, that does leave one other possibility. That leaves the possibility that, in fact, Socrates is corrupting the youth intentionally. And as we see in P2, Socrates denies this consequence as well. So what is his reason for this? Now let's see what he says here. So Socrates says, don't bad people do something bad to whoever's closest to them at the given moment, whereas good people do something good. Okay, so the basic idea is whoever you associate with, you're going to have an influence on them. So if you are a bad person, you're going to make those around you worse, and if you are a good person, you'll make the people around you better. So he says, does anyone wish to be harmed rather than benefited by those around him? Does anyone wish to be harmed? And then you say, of course not. No one wants to be harmed. So Socrates asks, am I by contrast so very ignorant that I don't know even this? That if I do something bad to an associate, I risk getting back something bad from him in return? Socrates says, well, look, if we accept that if you associate with bad people, it'll make you bad as well, then by Socrates corrupting all the young Athenians who hang around him, isn't he making himself worse off? And didn't we just agree that nobody wants to be harmed? So if that's true, then it would make no sense to say that Socrates is intentionally corrupting the youth, because that would mean Socrates is intentionally harming himself. But of course, that just seems completely and utterly ridiculous, he argues here. Now, in the way Socrates has explained that, it seems reasonable. But when we break it down, we see there's actually a claim there that should seem rather controversial to us. Because the fundamental claim in support of P2 is the following, that nobody wishes to be harmed. No one intentionally does something that makes themselves worse off. No one intentionally does something that harms themselves. But wait a minute, that doesn't seem right. In fact, as I think about it, I can think of many cases where people seem to intentionally do things that either harm themselves or have a high probability of harming themselves. Smoking, not exercising, eating junk food, texting and driving. We might say these are all things that from time to time people do intentionally, and they seem to know are going to make themselves worse off, and they do it anyway. So why couldn't we say this? Why couldn't Meletus respond and say, well, okay, this is just another one of those cases. Just like, a person might eat junk food even when they know it's bad for them. Socrates might be intentionally corrupting the youth, even though in some sense he knows it's going to be a bad thing for him. So what would be wrong with that response? And really, this gets to the following question. It gets to this phenomena that I've explained it seems very common, but it's also very difficult to explain. And I'm going to call that phenomenon knowing self-sabotage. So when does knowing self-sabotage occur? It occurs when I know that something X, like smoking cigarettes, not exercising, eating junk food, texting while driving, I know that thing is bad for me, all things considered, yet I do it anyway. And by all things considered, I just mean, When I think about the long-term consequences, I know this is a bad thing for me. Not just bad in the moment, but I know it's bad for me, all things considered. Now, you can probably all think of times when you've done this. Maybe you've done things on that list. Maybe you say, okay, I've got an exam coming up. I really shouldn't procrastinate. I know it's a bad thing. I know it's going to harm me to procrastinate. And then an hour later, you find yourself binging on Netflix. Right? We've all been in situations like this where we want to do what's best for us. We want to do what's right. And then we find ourselves falling into things we know are bad for us. And we do it over and over and over again. And from a philosophical point of view, we should really wonder, how is this possible? Why does this occur? And I want to suggest that there are two different ways you could look about this. And one way to think about this, here's a famous passage from the Bible. It comes from St. Paul. And St. Paul is talking about this sort of phenomena. He says, I don't really understand myself. For I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. But if I know what I'm doing is wrong, this shows that I agree the law is good. So, I'm not the one doing the wrong. It is sin living in me that does it. So Paul describes this. He says, I'm in a situation where I know what the right thing to do is. I know what's best for me, and I don't do it. How do I explain this? He has to resort to an explanation of, I'm not the person doing the wrong. It's the sin living in me. Now, on the one hand, you could see why he has to resort to this, because if you know it's bad for you, then why are you doing it? So Paul reasons, I must not be the one doing it. There must be something else. Whether you think about it inside of you or outside of you, some other sort of force within your psychology that's making you do this, but it isn't really you. And in a religious context, what St. Paul calls this is sin. It's a sin living in me that does it. He says, I'm not the one who did it, it's the sin living in me. And there's other words we might use for this as well. In fact, what I want to say is this statement by St. Paul suggests one possible explanation of knowing self-sabotage. Temptation. When you give in, when you eat the junk food, when you don't exercise, when you procrastinate instead of studying, when you text while you drive while you know you shouldn't, you're giving in to temptation. There's a certain weakness in you, a weakness of your will that has been overcome by temptation. And that's how we explain how you can do things that you know are bad for you. It's because ultimately you're weak. Now, this is a very common human phenomenon. It's very common to answer in this way. But the one thing I would push back about this explanation on is this. If you know that this thing, smoking cigarettes, not exercising, procrastinating, is bad for you, then why is it tempting? You might say, well, it gives you pleasure in the moment. Okay, sure. But you know that pleasure in the moment is outweighed by the larger amount of pleasure you would get overall. Right, so just take one example. Yes, it's pleasurable in the moment to not exercise and eat junk food, but at the end of the day, in the long run, it's more pleasurable to be healthy. And you know this, and you believe this. So, temptation's a weird response to give, because usually you say, well, you would be tempted by something good. Why would you in fact be tempted by something bad? That's a sort of very difficult thing to explain. And this is why this explanation of temptation I've just given you is not the one we see in Socrates and Plato. In fact, Socrates is relying on a different sort of explanation. The explanation that Socrates gives is ignorance. So, when we have a situation like this, when it seems like we're doing something we know is bad for us, Socrates says, you don't actually know it's bad for you. When you smoke cigarettes, even though you're saying to yourself, I know this is unhealthy, there's a sense in which you don't really know it's bad for you. You don't really know it's bad for you to procrastinate. Because he says, if you did know what the right thing to do is, you would always choose it. There would be no obstacle in your way. So this is in another dialogue, it's in the Protagoras. Socrates says, to give in to yourself is nothing other than ignorance, and to control yourself is nothing other than wisdom. So when you give in to yourself, when you give in to temptation, Socrates says you're just ignorant. You don't really know what is good for you. The person who is wise, who has knowledge, who knows how to live a proper human life, they are in control of themselves. And we see this connects back with the theme we've seen already. For Socrates, the key to living a good life is gaining knowledge. Ignorance is a disease of the soul. We get rid of that disease through philosophy, through gaining knowledge, through understanding the truth. And if we understand the truth, if we know what is good in a human life, then we'll do the right thing. And we won't have weakness of will. We won't be tempted by what's bad. So, certainly we can see why Socrates would say this, because he does want to say that the path to a good life is through philosophy, through trying to achieve knowledge. On the other hand, it's also a very odd explanation. Because in the examples I've just talked about, smoking and procrastinating and eating junk food and texting and driving, it does actually seem like we know it's bad. Like you can say to yourself, I know I shouldn't be texting and driving right now. I know how dangerous it is. I know about the studies that show it's as dangerous as driving while under the influence of alcohol. You can say you know all these things and then you still do it. Well, I agree that's a powerful objection. But I would offer the following example to bolster the ignorance view just a little bit. So imagine you're talking to a friend and you're having a conversation and let's say your friend is married and you're talking to him and it gets down to it and you find out that he's been cheating on his wife. He says, I've been cheating repeatedly on my wife, but also I love her with every single thing in my heart. Well, okay, that's sort of a strange thing to say. Now, granted, relationships can be complicated. I wouldn't deny that. But the idea that one could simultaneously say, I've been repeatedly and consistently cheating on my wife and that I love her with everything in my heart, that seems like a bit of a contradiction because, one instance of infidelity, okay, you can sort of square that. But multiple and repeated instances, that is a little more difficult to explain. So a question you might ask is like, well, what do you think love means? And let's say this person answered in the following way. I think love is a total and complete and utter commitment to the good of another person, a complete and utter devotion to them. And now you're just really confused, right? Because this person clearly knows the definition of love. They clearly know the definition of it. But yet all their behavior goes the other way. So how might we sort of explain this? Well, if you're Socrates, you'd have to say something like, look, this is a perfect example of how you can claim to know something in the abstract, but not fully appreciate it or fully understand it. You can have a dictionary definition of love as a complete and total devotion to another person and what's good for them and best for them, but not really understand what it means to love someone, which would imply, among other things, not consistently and repeatedly cheating on them. You can know in an abstract way, yes, I know texting and driving is bad for me, I know smoking cigarettes and eating junk food, I know all these things are bad for me. I can know that in an abstract way. But it's another to really appreciate how bad it's going to be for you, to really envision yourself years down the line, the damage it'll do to your body. Right, the poor health effects of smoking, to think yourself years down the line of what your life will be like. So you can know in an abstract way, yes, I know it's bad for me, but do you really understand how bad it is for you? Do you really appreciate that fact? Have you actually put yourself in the shoes of your future self who will be suffering those consequences? Okay, so this is why Socrates thinks the explanation for knowing self-sabotage is always ignorance. And so, to recap, let's think about, well, what does that actually mean in terms of this argument? So Socrates would be saying here, to Meletus, yeah, okay, my actions have corrupted the youth. But if he's right, then it would also mean I don't know that I'm corrupting the youth. And I don't know that corrupting youth is bad for me. If we're imagining, and if that's the situation, then notice again how inappropriate Meletus' actions would be. If it's really true that Socrates doesn't know he's corrupting the youth, and if he doesn't know corrupting the youth is bad for him, then again, what Meletus should have done is taken him aside and instructed him. And this is exactly what he says. He says, "For it's clear if I'm instructed, I'll stop doing what I do unintentionally. You, however, have avoid associating with me, and were unwilling to instruct me. Instead, you bring me here where the law requires you to bring those in need of punishment, not instruction." So if Socrates is merely doing this by accident, he should gain instruction. If he's doing this out of ignorance, then Meletus should tell him what he's doing wrong. In either case, he shouldn't be brought to court and brought up on these specific charges of corrupting the youth. Okay, so I will stop there for now. I hope that video was helpful, and I will see you next time.